It all began with a betrayal. A crack in the seemingly perfect facade of our life, one that splintered and spread, leaving us both fractured in its wake. She was my wife, my partner, the mother of my child. Together, we had built a life that, from the outside, appeared solid, comfortable even. A modest apartment in the city, steady careers, a beautiful son who had just turned one. To anyone looking in, we were the picture of stability, a family anchored by love and routine. But beneath the surface, that foundation was eroding, one lie at a time. It wasn't always like this. In the beginning, there had been joy, real joy. We had met through friends, drawn together by a mutual love of literature and a shared disdain for the superficial. She was luminous, her laughter infectious. I fell hard and fast, captivated by her wit and warmth. In her, I saw a future I wanted to build, and for a time we did. Marriage followed, then the birth of our son. Life seemed to settle into its rhythms, the days predictable and full of small, quiet joys. Then came the betrayal. I can't pinpoint the exact moment I began to suspect. Perhaps it was the subtle shifts in her behavior. Texts she would hurriedly hide, the way she seemed to pull away from me even when we were sitting side by side. Or maybe it was the sudden increase in late-night work obligations and the lingering scent of unfamiliar cologne on her clothes. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia, an overactive mind conjuring shadows where there were none. But the signs were there, accumulating like stones in a river, each one adding to the weight in my chest. When I finally uncovered the truth, it was like the air had been sucked from the room. She had been unfaithful, her affection stolen by someone else. A co-worker of all people. The knowledge was a wound that refused to heal, a constant ache that colored every interaction. Yet I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I let the revelation fester, turning it over in my mind, trying to understand the why of it all. Was it something I'd done? Something I hadn't done? Now, every moment between us felt charged, fraught with unspoken words and barely concealed tension. She knew I knew. I could see it in the way she avoided my eyes, her once easy laughter now replaced by a brittle silence. And though we still went through the motions of our daily lives, caring for our son, sharing meals, exchanging pleasantries, it was clear that something fundamental had shifted. The life we'd built was no longer a sanctuary but a battleground, each of us retreating to our corners, unsure of how or if we could move forward. And so, this is where our story truly begins. Not with the idyllic life we once had, but with the aftermath of her betrayal and the choices it would drive me to make. It was Monday evening when the air in the apartment felt heavier than usual. I sat at the edge of the couch, the hum of the muted television filling the silence. She was in the kitchen, her movements deliberate and slow, as if every step required extra effort. I watched her from the corner of my eye, the tension between us a thick, invisible wall. We hadn't spoken much since the night I revealed the truth. I thought it wouldn't matter, thought it was something she'd eventually understand and move past. But her demeanor since then had been a constant reminder of the damage my words had done. The unspoken resentment hung between us, palpable and suffocating. The kitchen smelled of roasted vegetables and grilled chicken, a meal she prepared with the same meticulous care she now gave to every task. She set the plates on the table without a word, and I followed her, sitting across from her. The scrape of utensils against the plates was the only sound, a grating reminder of the chasm that had opened up between us. Her eyes, once so vibrant, now seemed dulled by a mix of exhaustion and distance. She'd always been the type to wear her emotions plainly, and now they were etched into every line of her face. She looked tired in a way that went beyond physical fatigue, as though the weight of the past weeks had drained her of something vital. That I tried to focus on my meal, but my mind wandered. I thought about the moment I'd confessed, the way her expression had shifted from confusion to disbelief, then settled into a cold, quiet anger. She hadn't raised her voice or thrown accusations. That might have been easier to bear. Instead, she'd simply withdrawn, leaving me to stew in the guilt and regret of my actions. After dinner, I moved to the couch, while she busied herself cleaning up. I heard the clatter of dishes, the running water, each sound a sharp contrast to the silence that filled the rest of the apartment. I stared at the muted television, the flickering images doing little to distract me from the storm of thoughts swirling in my head. That I'd convinced myself that withholding the truth was the right decision, that it was for the best. But now, seeing the toll it had taken on her, I couldn't ignore the selfishness of that choice. I'd robbed her of something important, her agency, her ability to make a fully informed decision. And now, I was paying the price for it. The night dragged on, the hours blending into one another as I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling. Sleep was elusive, my mind replaying the events that had led us here. The fleeting moments of joy during the pregnancy, overshadowed by the lies I'd told. The birth of our son, a moment that should have been pure and untainted, now forever tied to my deceit. And her face, every glance a reminder of the trust I'd broken. In the early hours of the morning, I heard her footsteps as she moved from the bedroom to check on our son. The soft creak of the nursery door opening, then closing, was a small comfort. She still cared for him, for us, in her way. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted, that the bond we once shared was now irreparably frayed. The truth had been a weight I thought I could bear alone. But now it was clear that weight had shifted to her as well, and it was crushing us both. I lay there, staring into the darkness, wondering if there was a way to rebuild what had been broken, or if we were destined to remain two strangers tied together by a single, irrevocable act. The days after my confession stretched on endlessly. The atmosphere in the apartment remained heavy, a quiet tension weaving through every interaction. I'd find myself glancing her way, hoping for a sign. Any sign, that things might return to normal. But her distance felt insurmountable. She was there, yet not. Her presence a constant reminder of what I'd done. That I threw myself into the routine of caring for our son. Each morning, I'd wake up before her, preparing a bottle or tidying up the nursery. It felt like the only thing I could control, the only way I could contribute something meaningful. The little moments, his tiny fingers wrapping around mine, the sound of his soft laughter, became my sanctuary. He didn't know about the mistakes I'd made, the cracks I'd put in our foundation. To him, I was just dad, and that was enough. But even in those moments, the weight of her absence loomed large. She was cordial, polite even, but gone was the warmth, the ease of being around her. Every word felt measured, every look tinged with something unspoken. I'd catch her staring at me sometimes, her expression unreadable, and wonder what was running through her mind. One afternoon, as the sunlight filtered through the curtains, I decided I couldn't keep going like this. The silence between us had grown too loud, the distance too vast. I waited until our son was asleep, the rhythmic sound of his breathing filling the nursery. Then I walked into the living room, where she sat with a book in her lap. She wasn't reading, though. Her gaze was fixed on the window, lost in thought. That I cleared my throat, and she turned her head slightly, acknowledging my presence without looking at me fully. The space between us felt like a canyon. The words I'd rehearsed 1,000 times caught in my throat. How could I explain what I was feeling? How could I put into words the regret, the guilt, the desperate hope that we could somehow find our way back to each other? Instead of speaking, I sat down on the edge of the couch. The silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, she closed her book and placed it on the coffee table, her movements slow and deliberate. She turned to face me, her expression guarded but curious. And so, I began. I told her about the fear that had gripped me when I realized the consequences of my actions, the selfishness that had driven me to keep the truth from her. I told her about the nights I'd lain awake, haunted by the look on her face when I'd finally confessed. I spoke of the guilt that had settled in my chest, a constant reminder of the trust I'd shattered. I didn't expect forgiveness. I didn't even know if I deserved it. But I needed her to know that I understood the gravity of what I'd done, that I was willing to do whatever it took to make things right. As I spoke, I saw her expression shift, the hardness in her eyes softening just a fraction, the corners of her mouth trembling as if she were holding back words of her own. When I finally fell silent, the room was filled with a quiet stillness. She looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of the couch cushion. For a moment, I thought she might get up and leave, But instead, she stayed. "I don't know if things can ever go back to the way they were," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I appreciate you saying that. It wasn't forgiveness, not by a long shot. But it was something, a crack in the wall we built between us. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope that I in the days that followed. I tried to be more present, more attentive. I made it a point to listen when she spoke, to notice the little things she did and acknowledge them. I started taking on more responsibilities around the apartment, not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to ease her burden. Slowly, imperceptibly, the atmosphere began to shift. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, our son asleep in the nursery, she turned to me with a look I hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't quite the warmth of before, but it wasn't the cold distance either. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice steady but cautious. "About us. About what's next." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to say something, to offer reassurance, but I knew this was her moment to speak. So I stayed quiet, letting her find her words. "I don't have all the answers," she admitted. "But I think I want to try. For him. For us." Relief washed over me, but I kept my emotions in check. I knew this wasn't a resolution, just the beginning of a long road ahead. But it was a road I was willing to walk, no matter how difficult. That night, as we sat together in the quiet of the apartment, I felt the weight on my chest lighten just a little. There was still so much to work through, so many wounds to heal. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like we might have a chance. The following weeks were a blur of small, careful steps. Every interaction with her felt like walking a tightrope, balancing between hope and fear. The distance between us hadn't disappeared, but there were moments when it felt like we were moving closer, small glimmers of connection amidst the overwhelming weight of what we'd been through. I poured my energy into our son. His needs were simple, unburdened by the complexities that defined our relationship. Changing diapers, warming bottles, and rocking him to sleep became my rituals, grounding me in a world that often felt unsteady. His laughter, soft, pure, and unrestrained, was a balm for the tension that lingered in the apartment. But even as I focused on him, I couldn't escape the lingering sense of unease. Late at night, when the apartment was still, I'd lie awake, replaying the moments that had led us here. Her words, her expressions, her silences, they all stayed with me, a constant reminder of the fragility of our situation. One day, I decided to take a step I'd been avoiding. I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in years, my older brother. He had always been the pragmatic one, the person who could cut through emotional noise and offer clear, if sometimes blunt, advice. I needed that clarity now more than ever. We met at a small cafe on the edge of town, a neutral space far removed from the weight of my home. As I explained the situation, laying bare the mistakes I'd made and the consequences I now faced, he listened without interrupting. When I finally fell silent, he took a long sip of his coffee before speaking. "You screwed up," he said plainly. "Big time. But if she's still there, still willing to even consider a future with you, that means she hasn't given up. Don't waste that." His words stayed with me as I returned home. That evening I made a decision. I couldn't undo the past, but I could take responsibility for the present and build a better future. It wouldn't be easy, but nothing worth having ever was. The next morning, I woke early and started preparing breakfast. It was a small gesture, but one I hoped would show her that I was trying. As the smell of scrambled eggs and toast filled the kitchen, she emerged from the bedroom, her hair tousled and her eyes still heavy with sleep. She paused in the doorway, her expression unreadable. I set the plates on the table and motioned for her to sit. She hesitated for a moment before joining me. We ate in silence, but it wasn't the oppressive silence that had defined so many of our meals. It felt different, tentative, but not entirely uncomfortable. After breakfast, I suggested we take a walk with our son. The weather was crisp, the kind of early autumn day that begged to be enjoyed. To my surprise, she agreed. We bundled him up and set out, the stroller rolling smoothly over the pavement. The quiet between us was filled with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant laughter from a nearby playground as we walked. I found myself stealing glances at her. The soft sunlight caught in her hair, and for a moment, I was reminded of the early days of our relationship, those fleeting weeks before everything became complicated. She noticed me looking and raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental. That evening, as we put our son to bed, she turned to me and said something I hadn't expected. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady but cautious. "Maybe we could talk to someone, a counselor or a therapist, together." The suggestion caught me off guard, but I nodded without hesitation. "If that's what you want," I said, "I'm willing." The days that followed were filled with a renewed sense of purpose. We researched therapists, finally settling on one who came highly recommended. Our first session was nerve-wracking, the kind of vulnerability it required feeling foreign and uncomfortable. But as we spoke, haltingly at first, then with increasing openness, I felt a shift. The counselor helped us navigate the tangled web of our emotions, offering tools to communicate more effectively and understand each other's perspectives. The progress was slow, often frustratingly so. There were moments when it felt like we were moving backward, old wounds resurfacing and tempers flaring. But there were also moments of clarity and connection, small victories that reminded us why we were trying in the first place. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, our son asleep in the next room, she rested her head on my shoulder. It was the first time in months that she'd initiated physical closeness, and it took me by surprise. I didn't say anything, afraid to break the fragile peace of the moment. Instead, I simply sat there, feeling the warmth of her presence and the weight of her trust slowly returning. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were walking it together, and that, more than anything, gave me hope. Months passed, and the rhythm of our lives began to settle into something resembling normalcy. The tension that had once defined our every interaction was now replaced by a cautious understanding. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was progress, and that was enough for now. Therapy had become a regular part of our routine. Each session was a mix of breakthroughs and setbacks, moments of clarity interspersed with the resurfacing of old wounds. The therapist guided us through exercises to rebuild trust, encouraging us to share our fears and expectations without judgment. It was exhausting, emotionally draining work, but it was necessary. At home, we found ways to reconnect in small, meaningful ways. Friday nights became our time to sit together after putting our son to bed, sharing a glass of wine and talking about our week. We learned to laugh again, to find humor in the chaos of parenting and the imperfections of our situation. These moments, however fleeting, felt like glimpses of what could be. A future where we weren't just coexisting but truly living as a family. Our son was growing fast, his milestones marking the passage of time. His first steps, his first words, each moment was a reminder of the life we'd created together. Watching him explore the world with unbridled curiosity brought us both immense joy. He became a bridge between us, a source of unity when everything else felt uncertain. But even as we moved forward, the weight of the past lingered. There were nights when I'd wake up to find her sitting by the window, staring out into the darkness. I knew she was still grappling with the betrayal, the loss of the trust we'd once shared. I'd join her, sitting silently by her side, offering my presence without pushing for words. Sometimes she'd lean into me, her head resting on my shoulder. Other times, she'd remain distant, lost in her own thoughts. Work was another area of focus for me. I took on additional projects, hoping to contribute more financially and ease some of her burdens. It wasn't just about money. It was about showing her that I was committed to providing for our family, to being a partner she could rely on. There were days when the stress felt overwhelming, but it was a burden I was willing to bear. One weekend, we decided to take a short trip to a nearby park. It was her idea, a chance to escape the confines of the apartment and spend time together as a family. We packed a picnic and set out early, the crisp morning air invigorating. The park was alive with the sounds of laughter and birdsong, a welcome contrast to the quiet tension that had so often filled our home. As we spread out a blanket under a large oak tree, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in months. We watched our son toddle around, his excitement infectious as he explored the world around him. For a moment, it felt like everything was as it should be. Simple, uncomplicated, and full of possibility. That evening, as we drove home, she reached over and placed her hand on mine. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. I glanced at her, and for the first time in a long while, I saw a hint of the warmth that had once defined our relationship. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there. In the following weeks, we continued to build on these moments. We started discussing plans for the future, not just as individuals but as a family. The idea of moving to a larger place came up, a home where our son could have more space to grow and explore. It was a daunting prospect, but it also felt like a step forward, a tangible sign of the life we were trying to rebuild. Through it all, I remained acutely aware of the fragility of our progress. Trust, once broken, is not easily repaired. But I also knew that we were both committed to trying, to putting in the effort even when it felt difficult. There were no guarantees, no promises of a happily ever after. But there was hope, and for now, that was enough to keep us moving forward. The final days of that chapter in our lives arrived quietly, with no grand announcements or signs. Yet, as they unfolded, they carried the weight of everything that had come before. Each moment felt sharper, each word heavier, as though the air around us was thick with unspoken truths. One evening, after putting our son to bed, she asked me to sit with her in the living room. There was a gravity in her voice that set my nerves on edge. I joined her on the couch, the space between us feeling vast despite its physical closeness. She looked at me for a long time, her eyes searching for something I couldn't name. "I need to say this," she began, her voice steady but soft. "I've been trying, really trying. For us, for him, for the life we've built. But I can't shake the feeling that something is still broken, and I don't know if it can ever truly be fixed." Her words hit me like a blow, but I forced myself to stay composed. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked down at her hands, twisting them together nervously. "I love you. I do. But love isn't always enough. I don't want to wake up one day and realize we've spent years trying to force something that was never going to work. We owe it to ourselves and to him to be honest about that." I wanted to argue, to tell her that we could make it work, that we had already come so far. But deep down, I knew she was right. The foundation of our relationship had been cracked from the start, and despite our best efforts, the fractures remained. Love, while powerful, couldn't erase the past or heal wounds that had never been given the chance to properly mend. "So what do we do?" I asked, my voice trembling. She took a deep breath, tears brimming in her eyes. "We let go, not of our responsibilities to him or the respect we have for each other, but of the idea that we have to stay together to be a family. We can still be a family, just in a different way." The pain of her words was almost unbearable, but I couldn't deny the truth in them. We had been holding onto a vision of what we thought we should be, rather than facing the reality of what we were. Letting go felt like surrender, but perhaps it was the most courageous thing we could do. The days that followed were a blur of logistical planning and quiet, tearful conversations. We agreed to co-parent, to prioritize our son above all else. She would stay in the apartment, and I would find a place nearby to ensure I could be present in his life. We divided responsibilities and made promises to support each other as we navigated this new terrain. The night before I moved out, we shared one last dinner together as a family. It was simple, just takeout from our favorite local spot, but it felt monumental. Afterward, we sat together on the floor of the living room, our son nestled between us as we read him his favorite bedtime story. When he finally drifted off, his small body rising and falling with each breath, we sat in silence, the enormity of the moment settling over us. "Thank you," she said finally, breaking the quiet. "For trying, for being here, for everything." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. My heart ached with a mixture of gratitude and loss, the two emotions intertwining in a way that felt impossible to untangle. The next morning, as I loaded the last of my things into the car, she stood in the doorway holding our son. He waved at me, his little hand flapping enthusiastically, blissfully unaware of the significance of what was happening. I forced a smile and waved back, promising myself that I would be the father he deserved, no matter what. As I drove away, the weight of everything we'd been through pressed down on me. The road ahead was uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where love could exist not as an obligation or a desperate attempt to fix what was broken, but as a quiet, enduring presence in the life we had created together. The weeks that followed my departure from the apartment were a haze of adjustment and quiet reflection. The space I moved into was modest, a one-bedroom unit with just enough room for a crib and the essentials for when my son stayed over. The emptiness of the walls mirrored the hollowness I felt inside. Each evening, as I sat in the silence, I replayed the final days in my mind, searching for meaning, for clarity, for a way forward. Parenting in this new arrangement brought challenges I hadn't anticipated. On the days I had him, I poured all my energy into being present. I cooked his favorite meals, built elaborate forts in the living room, and read the same storybook until he could recite the words by heart. But when he was gone, when the apartment returned to its lifeless stillness, I was left to grapple with a sense of failure that gnawed at me relentlessly. Our co-parenting arrangement required constant communication, and while our exchanges were civil, they were tinged with an awkwardness that hadn't existed before. Texts about schedules and updates on milestones felt transactional, devoid of the warmth that once defined our connection. And yet, there were moments, brief and fleeting, when we managed to slip back into a rhythm, sharing a laugh over our son's antics or a knowing look during a handoff. Those moments were bittersweet, reminders of what we had once been and the distance that now separated us. One rainy evening, as I sat staring at a blank document on my laptop, trying to write something, anything, I found myself opening an old folder of photos. There we were, frozen in time, smiling on a sunlit beach, her hair windswept as she leaned into me. Our son as a baby, cradled in her arms, his tiny hand clutching her finger. The images were a cruel contrast to the present, a reminder of how much had changed. And yet they weren't lies. Those moments had been real, filled with genuine love and joy. I clung to that thought, needing to believe that what we'd shared hadn't been a complete illusion. Gradually, I began to piece myself back together. I threw myself into work, finding solace in the structure and routine it provided. I started running in the mornings, the rhythmic pounding of my feet against the pavement serving as a kind of therapy. And I began to write again, pouring my thoughts and emotions into stories that weren't my own but carried echoes of my experiences. Still, the nights were the hardest. They stretched endlessly, the silence amplifying the doubts and regrets I tried to suppress during the day. I thought about the decisions we'd made, about the inevitability of it all. Had we given up too soon? Had we fought hard enough? The questions circled endlessly, offering no answers. One afternoon, a few months after the separation, she called. Her voice was calm but carried an undertone of urgency. "He's been asking about you more lately," she said. "I think he's starting to notice the changes." The weight of her words hit me, and I realized how deeply I feared failing him. "I'll talk to him," I replied, my throat tight. "I'll try to explain." When I next saw him, I sat him down, my heart pounding as I searched for the right words. "Mommy and Daddy love you very much," I began, my voice trembling. "Even though we're not living in the same house anymore, we're still a family. We always will be." He looked at me with wide, curious eyes, his small hands fidgeting with a toy car. "You promise?" he asked, his voice so soft it was almost a whisper. "I promise," I said, my voice breaking. And in that moment, I realized that this promise, to be there for him, to show up, to love him unconditionally, was the only thing that truly mattered. Over time, a new kind of normal began to take shape. Birthdays were celebrated together, the awkwardness between us slowly giving way to a quiet camaraderie. We learned to navigate this new dynamic, our shared love for our son serving as a bridge over the chasm of our broken relationship. There were still moments of grief, of course. Small pangs of loss when I saw her smile in a way that reminded me of how things used to be, or when I caught myself instinctively reaching for my phone to share something with her, only to stop short. But those moments became less frequent, their sharp edges dulled by the passage of time. And then, one day, as I watched my son run across a park, his laughter ringing out like a melody, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Life hadn't turned out the way I'd envisioned, but it was still beautiful in its own imperfect way. We had built something fragile yet enduring, a testament to the strength of love in all its forms. This wasn't the story I had imagined for us, but it was ours. And for the first time, I felt ready to embrace it. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like,